This is the Americas Quarterly podcast. I'm Brian Winter. After 1 year in office, President Claudia Sheinbaum has surpassed many expectations when it comes to her handling of security, the private sector, and, of course, her relationship with President Trump. On today's episode, we'll look at the road ahead for Mexico, including potential risks to its relatively placid status quo.
I think there's an alarm in Mexico that what's happening in Venezuela is something that could be translated somehow into the Mexican-U.S. relationship. That doesn't necessarily feels like a scenario that's near, but we couldn't completely overrule it. And so I think there's always that red flag.
On October 1st, President Claudia Sheinbaum hit the 1 year mark of her presidency. And, well, it has not been an easy ride. Mexico's president has really had to balance three key relationships. The first, the one that has gotten the most attention internationally, is with President Donald Trump, whose decisions can make or break the Mexican economy. The second relationship is with another president, her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, who remains very powerful behind the scenes. The third relationship is, of course, with the Mexican people, who want President Sheinbaum to improve security, strengthen the economy, and ensure Mexicans in the United States are treated with dignity and respect. I was in Mexico City last week, meeting with a variety of people, and the overall impression was of a government surpassing its initial expectations. President Sheinbaum's approval rating is at 73%, and a plurality of Mexicans said in a recent poll that her government is off to a better start than AMLO's had. But one also hears plenty of concerns about potential storm clouds on the horizon. The belief that her relatively good relationship with Trump could deteriorate at any given moment, that her battle against organized crime is courageous but potentially fragile, and that the Mexican economy in particular is a risk as it suffers from a lack of investment and a great deal of uncertainty, in part because of the uncertain relationship with Washington. To take stock of all this, we've invited Brenda Estefan. She is a professor at IPADE Business School in Mexico City and a columnist for Americas Quarterly, as well as for Reforma, Mexico's leading newspaper. Brenda, welcome to the AQ podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Brian.
So, Brenda, I spoke in the introduction about the three key relationships of President Sheinbaum. Let's start with the first one, the one that the world knows the most about. After a year, what is the state of President Sheinbaum's relationship with Donald Trump?
Well, I think the return of Trump to the White House brought to light something that a lot of us knew already, but it's the structural weakness of the Mexican economy, given its huge dependence on the U.S. So clearly, Claudia Sheinbaum has understood this and has decided pragmatically to accommodate to Trump demands, striving to deliver in agendas such as fentanyl or migration. So there's, of course, also a change in the security strategy in Mexico. And one could definitely argue that this change in the strategy obeys in a good measure to Trump's pressure. The terms of engagement between Mexico and the U.S. are continuously under threat, giving the possibility of extra tariffs or even military action from the U.S. But generally speaking, one would argue that Sheinbaum and Trump have managed to have a relatively stable within this tension, but calm tension between the two countries.
Well, there's been a lot of global attention, Brenda, on the skill with which President Sheinbaum has handled this relationship. I feel like every global media outlet has done this story. I think America's Quarterly has as well. My question for you, though, is has striking that balance of attending to U.S. interests while also not caving to everything he asks and showing strength to the Mexican people. Has that been more difficult for her than perhaps some outsiders might appreciate?
Definitely. To start with, because within her political party, Morena, there is a substantial segment that's against concessions to Donald Trump's administration. She needs to convey the proper messages to her political base, the political party, and even her administration to convince them that this is the right path.
I was just in Mexico City for a week, and I heard the view that things with the United States seem okay for now. I heard this view from people in the private sector. I heard it from some people in the public sector. Do you think that's accurate, or are you still waiting, for the other shoe to drop? Do you think that there could still potentially be trouble in the bilateral relationship?
I definitely think there's still potentially be trouble in the coming years. We have with the tariff threats, we have a sort of Damocles hanging over the Mexican economy. And that, of course, has taken a toll on investments. Tariff threats in the case of Mexico are not only a case for economic protectionism, it's exercising pressure on the Sheinbaum administration so that she delivers on the other agendas that are crucial to the Trump administration. I mean, if you look at the bilateral agenda, the topics there are not so different as what we had before. In the economy, security, and migration, we would have to add China, of course. But what's very different is that before topics would be set aside and we would have separate tables for each topic, whether now it's all merged in the same negotiation.
But at the same time, Brenda, and just to repeat some of the things I heard when I was in Mexico, there's this view that, look, there will always be this pressure because this is what President Trump does. But he has reached a point where he understands at some level, the importance of Mexico to U.S. supply chains. And therefore, there's this view that you see reflected in the strength of the Mexican peso and in other financial markets that ultimately, while there may be some noise, the pillars of the bilateral relationship, including USMCA, will remain in place. Do you think that's too sanguine?
I think that's the general view. Both the business community, the media, they have the impression that things are going to be okay at the end of the renegotiation, but that it's going to be very bumpy and not without risks. Both in the Trump administration, but also on the Morena part of the spectrum, because it's not only Claudia Sheinbaum's view, but it's also the Morena part of the equation, the local part of the equation, which has been exercising pressure so that there's a red line on the administration, that it's all about collaboration, but that Mexico won't allow any unilateral intervention in Mexican soil. And if that's to be broken for whatever reason, that might create havoc in the relationship.
Well, Brenda, I was just about to ask you this question. What's the biggest risk to this, slightly uneasy status quo between the two countries right now? You're saying, if I understand you correctly, that it's a U.S. military strike on Mexican soil, which President Sheinbaum has made clear is a red line for Mexico. Now, as we record this, a substantial portion of the U.S. Navy is still in the southern Caribbean off of the coast of Venezuela. Is this something that people in Mexico are watching clearly as for hints as to what might or might not happen within Mexican territory?
I think there's an alarm in Mexico that what's happening in Venezuela is something that could be translated somehow into the Mexican-U.S. relationship. That doesn't necessarily feels like a scenario that's near, but we couldn't completely overrule it. And so I think there's always that red flag. The other thing that I think it's very tense, it's that within the frame of the USMCA review, there is a lot of pressure on the US side for Mexico to remove non-trade barriers. But those non-trade barriers are often related to the 4T, the Morena's main agenda, to AMLO's, López Obrador, political agenda, such as the energy reform. So I think there are going to be items on the agenda that are very politically sensitive on the Mexican side. And we would have to wait and see how are they handled by the Sheinbaum administration vis-a-vis the Trump administration.
The other big sensitive point in the bilateral relationship is Mexico's relationship with China. Now, the Sheinbaum government has announced plans to impose taxes as high as 50% on 1,400 products from Asia to protect factories at home. But it seems like this is also a geopolitical strategy by the Sheinbaum administration to attend to a U.S. interest or perhaps demand. What can you tell us about that? And, does it make it more difficult for Mexico to diversify? You started our conversation by talking about Mexico's extreme vulnerability on the United States. There are many other countries around the world that, kind of with one hand are doing what the Trump administration wants, but then with the other hand trying to diversify their trading and strategic relationships. Is there any sign of Mexico doing that?
Well, I think that the Sheinbaum administration understood that for the U.S., China is not only an item of economic rivalry, but also of national security. And I think the decision of proposing an increase in tariffs for countries with which Mexico has no trade agreements, it's clearly signaling that Mexico is aligning with the U.S. vis-a-vis the China issue. The thing is that even though the most pressing issue for Mexico in the international agenda, it's the USMCA review or renegotiation, probably the most strategic one, it's where does Mexico want to go in this new world reality? Because as you mentioned, Brian, there's a number of countries like Brazil or India or even Canada that when faced with Trump's threats have resorted to look for other partners, try to solidify their relationships with other countries. In the case of Mexico, given the huge dependency it has very little leeway to do this. But within the leeway that Mexico has, it could increase its trade with the Pacific countries. And also signing a trade deal or the new trade deal with the EU, which is already being negotiated but hasn't been signed by the Sheinbaum administration. In the aim of pleasing the Trump administration, Mexico is willing to be extremely careful with its relationships, not only with China, but with any other country. And so that worries me as Mexican, that we might be having a blind spot of what the new reality in Washington means for the future of the world order and how is Mexico going to play in this world order. It's okay to prioritize the U.S. relationship. It's natural. It's probably the only option that Mexico has. But clearly, it could be at the same time trying to strengthen relationships with countries that wouldn't create any tension within the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And that apparently is not being done.
It may just be that they're saying, look, we've got a reasonably stable thing going right now with President Trump. Let's not do anything to upset that. And I don't know. I if that's what it is, that makes some sense to me. But you're saying that it may not be in the long-term interest of Mexico to avoid that diversification.
I guess it makes sense to the extent that they are keeping an eye on what's happening in other latitudes, to the extent where they have a clear strategy on what's next for Mexico in the world. So that's my only concern. I'm not part of the Sheinbaum administration. Can't really tell you if it's happening, but I'd love to know that they're actually not only dealing with maneuvering with the terms of engagement with the U.S., but also working on the role of Mexico in the broader spectrum. And so I think, I mean, if you look at the numbers, over 80% of our exports go to the U.S., and that's over 40% of our economy, of our GDP. Also, if you look at the remittances, they were 3.7% of our GDP last year. So there's clearly a case for prioritizing the relationship with the U.S. That should be the number one priority, but it shouldn't be the only thing in the agenda. And that's my only worry.
We'll be back after a short break. The Americas Society Gallery in New York City is a fantastic place to see art from Latin America. Our current exhibit is called Amazonia Azul. It's a truly unique pan-Amazonian show that brings together paintings, sculptures, photographs, and more from all 9 countries of the Amazon region. It's on view through April 2026. We hope to see you here. Brenda, let's shift gears here and talk about President Sheinbaum's second very important relationship, and that is with her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO as he's known. What's the latest on what do we know at this stage about the relationship between those two?
Well, we do know that when Sheinbaum had her 1-year big event at the Zócalo, she gave a speech that, if you look at it carefully, it seemed catered to Morena's base, Morena's political leadership, and López Obrador, which is mainly, I'm not going to pick up a fight with López Obrador, even though the press is saying that there are some differences in between our projects. That's not the case, because we are aligned in the same principles. Before, when López Obrador was in office, he had a lot of control of the different segments and parts of his political movement, but Claudia clearly doesn't. And so it seems like the speech was willing to send the message saying, I'm going to follow the same path, and we all need to be on the same path. Otherwise, there will be action. So there was sort of a telling off of people in her political movement. It was not a speech for the broad Mexican society, which was pretty interesting, I find.
But so that was her message, and that was perhaps the message that she needed to give to the rank and file of a party that is, I suppose, broadly speaking, to the left of her on some issues. But what are the tension points? I mean, is it security?
So the tension points is that there are some political leaderships that are more closely aligned with AMLO's will than her will. So even though she's got an close to 80% approval rate, which is huge for any leader around the world, especially nowadays, but when you look at the political control that he has over the legislative or the governors, or even the new judiciary, one could argue that it's AMLO who's running the show. And so these create tensions in all sorts of things, from small decisions in towns or governorships to who's going to be the next candidate for a governorship, or law that's a priority for Sheinbaum, but that's not within the priorities of AMLO. For instance, she wanted to pass a law regarding nepotism, and it was blockaded of the legislative, which tells you clearly that she hasn't got full control of what's happening in the political arena, even though she has a great level of approval.
What's the risk here? And I ask this because we all understand personal relationships, and we all like to kind of gossip about them a little bit. I'm guilty of this. But from a perspective of, say, an investor or anybody concerned or who's watching Mexican politics, so what? I mean, what ends up being the risk if these two figures have strains? Why does it matter?
Well, it matters for the future of Sheinbaum's project, because in in the measure that she can have control over the political figures and political entities, she could advance her project. Otherwise, we could see a bifurcation of Morena. There's a number of people who believe that Claudia Sheinbaum might want to depart from AMLO's project. I don't believe so. I think she will stick to it as much as she can until the end of her administration, and that she will try to make sure that all those connections between political figures that are more aligned with AMLO are not broken, are not strained to the point that they cannot be redone. But in a way, what we see is a political figure like AMLO, who had a full control of the political scene in Mexico, versus Claudia Sheinbaum, who's sort of a by-headed political project, where she has no control or no full control of everything that's happening in the political spectrum.
Well, one area where it does seem there's been divergence between her government and López Obrador's is on security. And, famously, President López Obrador's strategy, he called it abrazos no balazos, hugs, not bullets. It was never that absolute, but he, broadly speaking, seemed to believe in a strategy of not confronting the cartels directly. She has gone in a different direction. She has a very strong and well-known security minister, Omar Harfuch, who I heard when I was in Mexico is not especially popular with the base of Morena, who is essentially they are upset that Sheinbaum is returning to what they see as a failed strategy that previous governments undertook, most notably the government of Felipe Calderón in the late 2000s. Is that where the real conflict is in your mind, Brenda? If there does prove to be a rupture between those two, or at least strains, could that have an impact on her ability to conduct this somewhat tougher security policy that she's engaged in since taking office?
I think in the same way that Claudia Sheinbaum is walking in a tightrope with the Trump administration at the internal level, she's also walking in a tightrope because she wants to push her own political wheels and her own political project. But at the same time, some parts of that project are not aligned with AMLO's political spectrum. Definitely, security is one of them. Omar Garcia Harfuch is someone who's very close to the president, and there are not many figures that are close to the president. But one needs to remember that he wanted to be Mexico City's mayor, and he was not able to run because Morena's political base supported a different candidate, which was Clara Brugada. So Sheinbaum wasn't able to push Omar Garcia Harfuch enough so that he could be Mexico City's Morena's candidate. He has a very strong fist on security agenda, and it departs clearly from AMLO. But I heard one interview when they asked him, is this a departure from the bullets not hug strategy from the AMLO time? He said, no, it's not. It's the same strategy. They won't say it publicly. They will say it's a continuation of addressing the root causes, even though we're seeing a complete different story playing out on the security agenda field.
I heard some speculation when I was in Mexico City that if she had to choose a successor as president today, which of course she does not, but if she did, it might be Harfuch.
Yeah, definitely, hands down. I don't think there will be another political figure that she'd like better than him. It's interesting how this is shaping because even though he's part of a at least self-perceived and self-called left-wing administration, he might end up trying to run a campaign on a left-wing political spectrum, but with a right-wing security strategy. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, that's a long way off, of course. Let's focus just for another minute here on security in the short term. Do you see any evidence that this tougher security strategy is yielding dividends?
Well, I think it's early to say. It's only been 1 year. I think what we can tell definitely is that there's a change. There's not hugs, not bullets anymore. There's clearly a high number of Lord kingpins that have been, of drug kingpins that have been neutralized, that have been put into jail. The fact that even the nephews of the former Minister of Navy are being investigated by the current administration regarding the what you call or the illicit traffic of fuel tells you a lot on how the scope is changing. We do see a bigger number of seizures of drug, and we do see a will to do a more coercive strategy. Whether there's going to be a long-term effect, positive effect, I think it's still to be seen. I especially think that a point that's crucial, it's how will Sheinbaum manage this political cover-up of organized crime? Because we know there's a connection between the political world and the organized crime in Mexico.
Let me switch gears again and ask you about the Mexican economy. And I have to confess, this was the area in which I left Mexico most concerned. On the one hand, the central bank recently lifted its GDP forecast for 2025 to 0.6%. They see the economy growing 1.1% next year. Those aren't good numbers. They're not necessarily crisis numbers, though. Inflation is relatively stable at about 3.7%. The budget deficit is a little higher than it has traditionally been in Mexico at about 4.3% this year. But, I guess the real story, the real thing that people are focused on is investment numbers have been falling. And this reflects a real issue with private sector confidence that you mentioned, Brenda, earlier. I mean, how concerned are you about the economy and the impact that it could eventually have upon this very high popularity that President Sheinbaum enjoys today?
I think a 0.6% growth for the Mexican economy on 2025, it's nothing to be happy about. I agree that there is a worry within the economic sector that things might worsen in the near future, especially because of what you mentioned, investment. Foreign investment has also not been very good. There's reinvestment, but there's not new investment.
By reinvestment, you mean you have a lot of companies that will reinvest the profits that they make within the Mexican market, but they're not bringing new capital in from outside the country for big projects.
That's right. So there's no new money. There's no fresh money coming into the Mexican economy. And also some formal job creation has been lowering in the previous couple of months. And so there's a worry that things might worsen in the coming months. And there's a worry of two things. One is that if the economy is not growing, but we have social programs that continue to grow, how are they going to be financed? The other worry is that there hasn't been enough infrastructure maintenance. And that's going to start to cause problems, be it in airports, ports, highways, hospitals, schools. We're starting to see this. What Morena has actually done is transfer all the funds that were dedicated to different programs within the government. It has been transferred to direct transfers given to different segments of the population. And that at the end, this is not sustainable. What's interesting is to see if she actually cuts down on deficit like she promised she would during 2025 to make sure that things in the macroeconomic spectrum are well handled. The other thing that's crucial, of course, is the USMCA review. If the USMCA review or renegotiation ends up being not only its bumps and complication, but it ends up giving certainty to the investors and sending a clear message that North America is going to be seen like a region that's going to be continuing to work together, given that we not only manufacture things from the US or Canada, but Mexico co-produces things with the US and Canada. Given that reality, if the USMCA review turns out okay, I think that'd be a good relief for the Mexican economy.
So, Brenda, in conclusion, what I'm hearing from you is, we have a first year, a government that has some accomplishments, that has handled certain issues, specifically the relationship with Trump and security, better than most people expected, but still with significant, problems, challenges on the horizon. And, some of them are not the ones we think of. Some of them also include the president's own party, as well as, of course, just the constant unpredictability of President Trump.
Yeah. I think that's accurate, and I believe that there's one extra point to put on the table in terms of economy, which is the judicial reform. There's a part of Mexicans that believe that the pressure that Trump is exercising on Sheinbaum to change the security strategy, it's also going to be something that will go on to other arenas, including the judicial reform or democracy in Mexico. And I think that's a big mistake. I don't think Trump is the opposition in Mexico. Trump has his own political project who he is focused on, and Mexicans should work on our fragile points, on our opportunities to make sure that in this new reality, because of course things are not going to go back to how they were before, that in this new reality, we are doing the internal work and also the international agenda that better caters our interests.
Brenda, thanks so much for being here on the AQ podcast.
Thank you, Brian, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Americas Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Americas Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.